You know, when you think about the world's biggest challenges, things like climate change or global health crises, or even economic inequality, they don't really care about our neat little academic boxes, do they? They're not just biology problems or economics problems, they're everything, all at once. They demand that we connect the dots. But is that actually how we're taught to think? How we're taught to learn? It's a big question, so let's dig in.
Just think about your own school days for a second. The bell rings, you go to math. The next bell rings, you're in history. Then science, right? Each class was its own little universe, with its own language, its own rules, totally separate from the others. Well, that's what we call siloed learning. And there's this growing idea, this movement that's asking, is there a better way to do this?
And the answer that's bubbling up is something called interdisciplinary education, or IE for short. And honestly, the definition is super straightforward. It's basically any kind of education that just refuses to stay in one lane. It's all about intentionally mixing things up, blending different subjects, and making connections between fields that you might not normally put together.
Okay, so that's the big idea, but what does this actually look like in practice? Well, for that, we're going to look at this really fascinating experiment that started in London back in 2012. University College London, or UCL, launched this super innovative degree called the Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, the BASC. And you got to understand, this was a huge deal in the UK, because their system is usually all about hyper-specialization from day one.
And guess what? It totally took off. I mean, it started with just 87 students in that first year, but it grew like crazy. Just a few years later, by 2016, there were over 450 students in the program. So this wasn't just some small, niche little experiment. No, this was a major initiative, and it proved that there was a real hunger out there for this different way of learning.
And the way they structured it is where it gets really, really cool. Get this, they split a student's time right down the middle, 50-50. So half of their classes are what you'd expect, traditional subjects in what they call a pathway. But the other half, that was a mandatory core of interdisciplinary classes, and it all built up to a final, real-world team project. So it's a true blend.
Now, here's the kicker. The one rule that made it all work. Students had to bridge what's often called the two cultures of arts and sciences. So if your main focus was something in the humanities, like cultures or societies, then you were required to pick up subjects from health and environment or sciences and engineering. There was absolutely no hiding in your comfort zone. You were literally forced to learn the language of these completely different academic worlds.
All right, so the million-dollar question is, does it actually work? What happens to the students? To find out, researchers sat down with 13 of them to get the real story, What's it actually like to be in this program day to day? What kind of skills or qualities do you need to thrive? And what they found was, well, it was surprisingly consistent.
From all these conversations, 4 big themes just kept popping up over and over again. The students talked about openness, creativity, something they called bridging, and the importance of taking on multiple perspectives. So let's dive into what they meant by each of those.
First up was openness. One student, Annalie, put it perfectly. You need to be very open-minded. And for these students, this wasn't just some vague personality trait. Oh no, it was an essential skill, something they had to actively work on. It was about being open to totally new ways of thinking, new ideas, and, maybe most importantly, having the humility to say, hey, I don't get this, can you explain it to me?
Then there's creativity. And I love this quote from a student named Eva. She basically said, look, all these academic disciplines, they're just made-up boundaries. We invented them. And to see past those lines, to connect something like physics with philosophy, well, that takes a real creative spark. It's about spotting those novel connections that someone stuck deep in one field might totally miss.
And that idea of making connections flows right into the third quality, bridging. This is such a great concept. A student named Adriano saw himself and his classmates as translators. He made this brilliant point that, yeah, a scientist and a historian might both speak English, but they don't speak the same academic language. They have different terms, different assumptions. The interdisciplinary student, they become that crucial bridge, the one person in the room who can actually connect both sides of the conversation.
And that brings us to the final quality, perspective taking. And wow, this quote from Nadia really hits home. She said the course taught her to listen, and it taught her that she's not always right. I mean, think about that. Being constantly thrown into situations where you have to grapple with completely different ways of thinking, and you have to justify your own views, that's a huge lesson in intellectual humility.
Okay, so this all sounds amazing, right? These students are developing these incredible skills. But the researchers themselves pointed out a huge question here. It's that classic chicken or egg problem. Is the program actually creating these skills? Is it teaching students to be creative and open-minded? Or does it just attract the kind of people who are already like that to begin with?
So that's the core debate. On one hand, you have the strong position, which says this type of education actively fosters traits like creativity. It builds them. On the other hand, the weak position says it mostly just attracts students who already have those traits. Now, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a mix of both, but it's a really important distinction to think about.
But here's the thing. Regardless of which came first, the chicken or the egg, why should we even care? Let's zoom out for a second and think about the big picture. What is the ultimate value of learning this way in the kind of complex world we live in today?
Well, here's the crucial point, and it's a little counterintuitive. Even if you only accept the weak position that these programs just attract a certain type of student, that still proves how incredibly valuable they are. Why? Because it shows there's this whole group of bright, curious students out there whose needs just aren't being met by the traditional one-track system. We have to provide a home, a path for these kinds of thinkers.
And the students themselves, they totally get the real-world value. One of them, Tom, who had already worked with some top consulting firms, just laid it out there. He said, employers will want it more. The world needs people who can think across these boundaries because that's where the really innovative, creative solutions are going to come from.
And there's actually a great term for these kinds of skills that the researchers use: meta-instrumental skills. It sounds a bit academic, but the idea is simple. An instrumental skill is something very specific, like knowing how to code in Python. A meta-instrumental skill is bigger than that. It's that higher-level stuff: open-mindedness, creativity, perspective-taking. These are the skills you can apply anywhere, and they're the real superpower you get from breaking down these silos.
So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a question to chew on. And it's not just about college degrees. Because let's be honest, we all live and work in our own kinds of silos, right? The marketing department doesn't talk to the engineers. The finance people have their own language. The person who loves history never reads about neuroscience. So the question for you is, what are the walls in your world? And what amazing things might happen if you started trying to knock them down?